This is part 2 of my exploration of the upcoming Path of Exile mechanic, Ward. In this video, I will correct a mistake I made in part 1, clarify a couple of things that I didn't explicitly mention in part 1, go into more detail about the order of combat calculations as they relate to Ward, and finally attempt to evaluate Ward's usefulness by quantifying its effect on effective HP, discussing its opportunity costs, drawing my conclusions, and sharing some build ideas involving Ward that I may test in Expedition League, which starts later today. Let me start by correcting something I said in the first video. I incorrectly identified Immortal Call as one of the defensive layers capable of negating all physical damage from a hit. I had forgotten that Immortal Call can only consume up to 5 endurance charges, which means the less physical damage taken effect will not reach 100%. Thus, Immortal Call always allows some damage to get through, which means it does not have the synergy with Ward that I pointed out in part 1. Sorry about the mix-up. I don't think many people were planning to use that particular interaction, but it was an oversight nonetheless. For the sake of thoroughness, I want to answer a few questions about Ward mechanics that I either have gotten or anticipate that I will get. First of all, Faithguard does not cause conversion from life to energy shield to turn into conversion from life to Ward. For instance, Corrupted Soul makes you gain 15% of maximum life as extra maximum energy shield. Pairing this with Faithguard does not make you gain 15% of maximum life as extra Ward. Faithguard also doesn't cause the Agnostic's maximum energy shield is 0 modifier to set Ward to 0. Both of these things directly follow from the fact that Faithguard only deals with increases and reductions, so use this as a rule when asking yourself if a particular energy shield modifier interacts with Faithguard. I've seen a couple of people ask how Petrified Blood interacts with Ward. It doesn't really interact with Ward, but it does happen in a later step than Ward. Petrified Blood is essentially the very last step in combat calculations. It's done after damage taken is determined, and even after the game decides which resources are taking that damage. Basically, Ward absorbs damage, then Energy Shield absorbs damage, then Mana absorbs damage if you have Mind Over Matter effects, and what's left goes to your life. Petrified Blood interacts only with the portion, if any, that goes to your life, delaying part of that life loss. Some people expressed that they were interested in a more detailed look at how Ward stacks up with other defensive layers, so I'll work out one scenario here. I'll try to make this example realistic instead of overly academic. That will make it more practical, but it won't showcase all of the defensive options available to players. Let's say you're playing a Raider with the following defensive layers. Given your evasion rating and the enemy's accuracy rating, you have 50% chance to evade. We'll also say that through Acrobatics, Soul of Lunaris, and Quartz Infusion, you have 60% chance to dodge attack hits. In addition, you have Fortify, Wind Dancer, Kintsugi, and Aspect of the Crab as mitigation layers. Although this isn't a block build, you have 17% chance to block attacks because you're using a shield with Acrobatics. As for HP, you have 6,000 maximum life, 1,000 ward, and level 20 Steel Skin linked to level 20 cast when damage taken. The enemy attempts to hit you with an attack that deals 10,000 raw physical damage. Because it is an attack, an evasion check is performed. Since this is the first incoming attack, the evasion check is pure RNG, in this case a random 50% chance to evade. Let's say you successfully evade the attack. Evasion's entropy system now guarantees that the next attack will succeed. The next attack is performed and, sure enough, gets through your evasion. It is now subject to a dodge roll. Unlike evasion, dodge is always pure RNG and doesn't have built-in protection from streaky behavior. Unluckily, this attack gets through your dodge, which now officially means you will be hit by the attack. No further defensive layers can prevent you from being hit. Next up are damage taken as modifiers, but you have none. Then we apply physical damage reduction, resistances, and avoid damage modifiers. The only relevant one here is physical damage reduction. You have 20% physical damage reduction thanks to crab barriers from Aspect of the Crab, but have no armor or other sources of physical damage reduction. Consequently, the 10,000 physical damage becomes 8,000 physical damage during this step. Next are modifiers to damage taken. In this example, we have Fortify, Kintsugi, and Wind Dancer. Each of these applies a separate 20% less damage taken modifier to the remaining damage, cutting it down to 3,277 physical damage. The last step that can change the amount of damage taken by the hit is block. If the 17% block chance succeeds, the damage dealt will be 0, which prevents this hit from breaking Ward. Unfortunately, the block roll fails, so we move on to the next step. Now we know how much damage is dealt by the hit, and we need to know where that damage will be dealt. The Jinxed Juju and Frost Shield are not relevant to this example. Aegis skills aren't either, but it's worth a reminder that if an Aegis skill were to absorb all the remaining damage from a hit, there would be no damage left for Ward to absorb. Thus, Ward would not break, even though technically damage had been taken by you. Next up is Steelskin, which is not currently active and therefore does not absorb any damage. If it were active, it would take either 70% of the remaining damage or 2,209 damage, whichever is lower, and then pass the rest onto your Ward. Since Steelskin is inactive, the full 3,277 damage is passed on. Because there is a non-zero amount of damage left at this stage, Ward breaks and absorbs up to its full amount in damage. Thus, 1,000 of the 3,277 damage is redirected to Ward, and 2,277 damage is passed along. You have no energy shield or mana before life modifiers, so all of the remaining 2,277 damage is taken from life, causing 2,277 life loss. If Petrified Blood were part of this example, it would prevent 40% of this life loss and apply some of the rest over the next 4 seconds. However, you don't have Petrified Blood, so you simply lose 2,277 life. At this point, if another hit is taken shortly afterward, it goes through all of the same steps, but with different conditions. First of all, since you've been hit recently, Wind Dancer and Kintsugi no longer lower damage taken, but in exchange, your evasion rating is much higher than before. Furthermore, since physical damage was taken from a hit, all crab barriers are lost, and you no longer have the full 20% physical damage reduction. Also, Ward is now broken, which means it will not redirect any damage from the next hit. Lastly, you took 3,277 damage from the last hit, and level 20 cast when damage taken has a threshold of 3,272 damage taken. Consequently, Steelskin has been triggered, and can now help offset the period of weakened protection, provided you had enough mana to trigger it. I won't continue to explain what happens with subsequent attacks, because I don't want to take up any more time with this example. Hopefully my explanations so far have left you equipped to continue this example yourself, or to impose your own hypotheticals on it. If not, feel free to ask for clarification. I don't mind being detailed in the comments. To guide the subsequent discussions involving my personal evaluation of Ward, I'd like to propose a framework for quantifying its merits. As a starting point, let's envision what the best-case scenario for Ward is. Ward is most efficient under the following 2 conditions. First, you are damaged by hits infrequently enough that Ward always has time to restore between damaging hits. Second, incoming hits are large enough that they always equal or exceed your Ward value. If these very optimistic conditions are met, then you can informally view every point of Ward as a single point of HP, like life or energy shield. In other words, 500 Ward is essentially 500 HP, under ideal conditions. Note that by HP, I'm referring strictly to resources that take damage, like life, energy shield, or most guard skills. My use of the term HP does not account for mitigation and avoidance layers like Fortify and Evasion. For that, I use the term effective HP. What I'm saying here is that on a life-based build, every point of Ward is ideally equivalent to 1 life. Of course, in practice, Ward will not operate under ideal conditions. Even on highly mobile, avoidance-heavy builds, you will still sometimes be hit more than once per Ward restoration cycle. Furthermore, there's no guarantee that the hits that do break your Ward will do as much damage as your Ward can absorb. One way to think about Ward is by averaging out the HP it provides, accounting for the frequency and magnitude of incoming hits. For instance, if you are damaged twice per Ward restoration cycle, and these hits deal damage equal to only 1/3 of your Ward, then Ward operates at 1/6 efficiency, and 600 Ward is equivalent to 100 HP on average. Thus, a 5,000 life character would essentially become a 5,100 life character, which is a 2% increase in HP, and therefore a 2% increase in effective HP. Ultimately, this framework is flawed, because you can't always think of things in terms of averages. Monster abilities can vary immensely in damage and frequency, and most avoidance layers can be streaky, the exception being Evasion with its entropy system. Nonetheless, this is a useful way of examining how your other defensive layers can impact the efficiency of Ward. On a character properly built for it, Ward can approach 100% efficiency, providing close to 1 HP per point of Ward. Given Ward's mechanics and the builds it's designed to complement, one could argue that it's more useful to consider the effectiveness of Ward only in the worst-case scenario. In other words, how much HP can Ward give me when I take a massive hit, and what is the probability that Ward will be active when that massive damage is dealt? In this scenario where we only care about a massive hit, we can assume that Ward will always absorb its full amount when it breaks. Thus, the only variable other than your total Ward is the probability that Ward will be up, which again varies according to what you're fighting and how much you've invested into avoidance layers and Ward restoration speed. If you're fighting a boss with large, infrequent hits, there's a high likelihood that you'll get full value out of Ward. If you believe that type of fight is your character's weakest link and are designing your build around that scenario, then you might consider 1000 Ward to be the same as 1000 life. On the other hand, if you're in a busier fight with more incoming hits, then you might be getting hit, for example, twice per Ward restoration cycle. In that scenario, the probability of Ward absorbing any given hit is 50%, and the hit that breaks Ward may or may not be one that's large enough to fully utilize it. The question then becomes, if Ward isn't guaranteed to be up when I need it, is it still worth it? I don't think that question has a simple answer, but before I draw any overall conclusions, I want to discuss the opportunity costs of investing in Ward. It's not possible to have a complete discussion about Ward's opportunity costs without knowing all the possible places it can come from. However, I can still speak generally about the options currently known to us, which are quite limited. As far as we know, the only way to obtain base Ward is through the Expedition base types. This means the opportunity cost for getting started with Ward is giving up some of the local defenses that you would get from non-Expedition item bases, such as armor, evasion, and/or energy shield. For example, you might be giving up 1000 evasion rating on a helmet to get 500 Ward, which means trading some chance to evade for some conditional HP. In terms of scaling the Ward you get from items, I talked about this in the last video, but the known options are increased defenses modifiers and Faithguard with increased maximum energy shield modifiers. Regarding increased defenses modifiers, the most significant source is from body armor, in the form of either Skin of the Lords or Grasping Mail. Skin of the Lords makes sense if you need a particular keystone from it, such as Phase Acrobatics or Wind Dancer. Grasping Mail is a higher investment option that allows you to get the modifier while still retaining powerful rare affixes. Both of these have very high opportunity costs, however, as body armors are often the most powerful slot for defense. Influenced rare body armors are highly impactful and hard to pass up on. Also, depending on your build, you could instead be passing up on uniques like Kintsugi, Cloak of Defiance, or maybe even Kraken's Carapace. One potentially low-impact way to boost your Ward is to use a Clutching Talisman, but if your build would otherwise use a powerful Influenced Amulet or a build-enabling unique, this may not seem worth it either. Players particularly interested in scaling high amounts of Ward may consider using Faithguard. Faithguard is already a great item for Ward simply because it makes Ward restore faster. It's not clear what the range of this modifier is yet, but 20% faster Ward restoration means you could absorb 20% more hits than before, making the restoration period closer to 4 seconds than 5. That benefit aside, Faithguard allows you to scale your Ward through many of the avenues available to energy shield users, the details of which I've already covered in part 1. In terms of the opportunity cost of Faithguard, you need to consider the benefits of simply using a rare Ward-based helmet. Is Faithguard, with its faster Ward restoration and improved scaling for Ward, better than a rare helmet with 80 maximum life, 500 Ward, and a set of rare suffixes? The answer to that question depends on how much Ward you can get from other gear slots. If the only other slots are gloves and boots, then you'd have a hard time getting enough base Ward to scale through Faithguard. If, on the other hand, there are Ward bases for body armor and shields, that could make Faithguard a very interesting choice, particularly if you plan to heavily invest in Ward as a major defensive layer. You should also consider the opportunity cost of investing in increased maximum energy shield modifiers, if you plan to do so. Allocating energy shield clusters on the skill tree may not be the most efficient use of points. Based on the information currently available to us, my overall impression of Ward is that it will be good, but very situationally. It will almost certainly not be something worth throwing on a character that isn't otherwise built around it. It also doesn't seem like something worth going all in for at the expense of other defensive layers. Ward looks like it's best used as a low investment complement to a character that's already heavily invested in layers of defense such as evasion, dodge, block, and aegises. The most common source of apprehension surrounding Ward seems to be that it leaves open the possibility that very small hits can break Ward, making you vulnerable to large hits while Ward is broken. This is a very real concern, and one that I share. This leads to the argument that Ward isn't useful, because of the possibility that it isn't there when you need it the most. I would argue that it is useful, because of the possibility that it is there when you need it the most. Whether it's actually worthwhile to invest in Ward depends on how much Ward you can reasonably get on an appropriate build, but in principle, it is possible for a mechanic to be good without being 100% reliable. There's a sentiment I see a lot, especially regarding evasion builds, that chance-based defenses are useless because you're dead as soon as they fail. That mentality only works if you don't layer those chance-based defenses with some mitigation and a comfortable amount of HP. Evasion and dodge are extremely efficient defenses on average, but if you don't combine them with defenses that prevent one-shots, you don't have the luxury of thinking in terms of averages. However, the more reliable your mitigation is, the more that luxury starts to materialize, and the more attractive evasion and dodge become. Extending that principle to Ward, it can be a great addition to an otherwise well-rounded avoidance-based build, but using it as your main defensive layer is probably not advisable, at least from what I can tell before release. If properly utilized, the average benefit given by Ward can outweigh its opportunity cost. I estimate that having somewhere between 400 and 1,000 wards should be reasonably attainable with minimal sacrifice to other defenses. For example, let's say you're playing a Raider build that's moderately invested into evasion with 60% attack dodge, 75% spell dodge, and some mitigation layers like Fortify and Wind Dancer. This type of build can probably afford to drop its evasion-based gloves and boots without losing a significant amount of evasion rating. Ward-based boots and gloves will probably be enough to get you to 400 or 500 ward without much effort, even with life rolls. Between the 60% attack dodge and the moderate amount of evasion, you're already not going to be hit by attacks very often. Combine that with the 75% spell dodge, and you're on your way to getting good mileage out of the small amount of ward. I'm not generally a fan of over-investing into defenses that aren't my weakest link. I've played a 95% evade chance build before, and while it's really awesome, I don't think it's worth going all in for, especially if you have high attack dodge. The purpose of these avoidance layers is to space out incoming damage enough that your mitigation and recovery layers can do the rest, not to prevent you from ever being hit in the first place. I will very likely take advantage of Ward with one or two of my builds in Expedition League, but I don't currently plan to use it as a focal point for any build. It's possible that once more is known about Expedition League items, I will be inspired to make Ward a focal point, but for now the idea is to use very small amounts of Ward on evasion and block builds to get some easy conditional HP. In other words, I won't be playing any Ward builds, but I will be playing some builds that use Ward. As such, describing these builds will not be very exciting, at least not because of the Ward mechanic itself. One idea I have is to play a Mana Bond Elementalist, using Stormfire and scaling Ignite through critical strikes. The build would get 67% attack dodge and 75% spell dodge with the help of Phase Acrobatics and the Omeokon boots. It should be able to inflict 40% chills and 60% shocks with Shaper of Winter, Shaper of Storms, and some choice Cluster Jewel notables. Mobility should be quick with a 0-duration Lightning Warp, and spamming it will trigger Disorienting Display, which will ensure I'm not hit by 2 consecutive attacks with Blind. The avoidance layers, combined with the high mobility of Lightning Warp and the high chill effect, will hopefully keep the frequency of incoming hits low. Also, the Primal Aegis skill provides some extra defense for spiky elemental damage. Unfortunately, the build can't reasonably use Kintsugi or path all the way to Wind Dancer. Also, because it scales with unreserved mana, I can't use Aspect of the Crab. Nonetheless, the defensive layers that are present make this build a good candidate for moderate investment into Ward for one-shot protection. Furthermore, this build won't get much mileage out of the default defenses that appear on rare item bases, so Ward is a decent way to fill that gap. This is obviously not a sufficient description of the build if you're looking to emulate it, but properly explaining it would be beyond the scope of this video. I'd rather test the build myself and, if it turns out well, put out a detailed explanation of it in a separate video. Other builds I may try that complement Ward include a Shattering Steel Deadeye with Wind Ward and a Martyr of Innocence Gladiator with Kraken's Carapace. None of these ideas are tested, so I will not recommend them. I fully anticipate that somebody will come up with a build that more heavily invests in Ward, using Faithguard to scale it into the thousands. That just isn't my current plan with it. When the inevitable Part 3 to this series comes out, it will be at least a few days into Expedition League, and all the options for Ward will be on the table at that point. That's about all I have to say about Ward for now. Come back later for Part 3, in which I'll briefly talk about any new developments on Ward, such as available base types, item affixes, and additional scaling options. Thanks for watching.